All right, so welcome back. Hey, this is Vernon Ross, and this is the Social Strategy Podcast, bringing you the best in business, wealth, and mindset. I haven't said that in so long, and the reason I hadn't said that is because I basically walked away from this show. And it's a long story. It's not that complicated, but it sort of is. So there's this thing in podcasting, and it's called pod fade. Usually it's when a podcaster, they lose their motivation for their show for whatever reason. Usually it's content creation, the trouble of scheduling guests, all sorts of things. Well, with me, it was none of that. Although one of the things that I was starting to grow tired of were repeated interviews, because you can only interview so many Facebook experts. You can only talk to people so much about Twitter and Instagram and the next thing that comes up. And it got a little mundane. It got a little boring. There's plenty of content to talk about, but I didn't want to talk about that anymore. And there were a couple of particular interviews that I just refused to publish, not because they weren't okay interviews. They were okay interviews. They weren't great interviews. And I hate that I took the time to record with those people, because they deserve to have their interviews published. And at some point, I may actually publish one of those interviews, but I probably won't. At least not on this podcast. As a matter of fact, I won't publish the interviews that I'm talking about ever. But those people have their interviews and they're happy with them, and it's great. And like I said, in and of themselves, they were not bad interviews. They just weren't what I wanted to do. And there was a particular interview with a marketing director of a company that wanted me to do some affiliate work for them. And I wanted to talk to the founders of the company, get their story, do what I like doing best, talking about how they got started in their business, some interesting facts about them as people, because this podcast was never really about just social media strategy. But it got to be one of those things where I was just done. My goal with this podcast was always to get to 100 episodes, evaluate it, and then decide to move forward. I got to 95 and was just done, and walked away from it and decided to create another podcast, to open up the subject matter, to be able to talk about more of what I wanted to be able to talk about. That podcast was called The Space Between Podcast. I got to about 6 episodes, and then that stopped. And the funny part about it is that, a lot of podcasts don't actually get to 10 episodes, and they don't get to 10 episodes most of the time because there's no plan. There's no actually path to success with their podcast. That really wasn't the deal with me. I got very involved in the other side of the industry, which is kind of what I want to talk about today. I got involved in and working with Podbean and working with a few other companies and building out very large podcasts for corporate clients, for big companies. So one of the things that I launched during this period of time was a website called enterprisepodcaster.com. It is still out there. It's my current website. Of course, vernonross.com is always going to be out there. That website is changing. It got hacked a couple times, and it's in a state of flux right now. It still looks decent, but it does need to be updated. However, enterprisepodcaster.com is where I'm taking care of my corporate clients. And I also produced a few podcasts, produced a few public podcasts, one where I was kind of the showrunner and guidance and producer for Around the Farm. It's a podcast that the Bear Corporation runs. I helped Patrice Washington launch her podcast, as she mentioned so graciously on her podcast, the Redefining Wealth podcast. It is awesome. You guys should definitely listen to it. One of my favorite, not just because I helped her get it started, but because it is great. She is the ideal podcaster. She doesn't really call herself a podcaster, but she's consistent and she puts the content out there week after week after week. And we've gotten our show to, I think it's probably well past 1.5 million downloads at this point. I know it was close to that a couple of months ago or a few months ago. And she did that within a 3-year period of time to get to 1 million downloads and grow an extremely large audience. It's just awesome. But I got really involved in doing that kind of stuff. And when you do, it's not like when you do a job and then you don't want to go home and do more of that job. It really wasn't that. It was becoming busy with the things that were making money. Because as a podcaster, and all podcasters out there, if you're listening to this, you know that one of the things you want to do with your podcast is monetize your podcast. Well, the way that I was monetizing my podcast and basically monetizing my message was with the work that I was doing because of my notoriety and expertise in podcasting and everything else around it. So being able to sell someone podcast services and then explaining to them the equipment that they needed, the expertise that they needed, how to conduct an interview, how to structure an interview, how to tell a good story, how to build a story and get people excited about what your message actually is what I loved to do, but not the way that I was doing it. So I really got wrapped up in the business end of it, and getting behind this microphone that I love so much wasn't a priority. And it became not a priority because I was like, oh, I can always just jump on the mic and record this and record that. And, I will record a few things here and there and stuff like that, but I really wouldn't actively record episodes of the podcast. And I didn't know whether or not it was I didn't like what I was doing with the space between podcasts, because I absolutely did. I had 3 really solid interviews. One with Dr. Mildred Payton, where she talked about bullying and the effects of bullying and the corporate environment and in schools. And amazing woman, love her to death. She still does a lot of stuff on Instagram, and she's all over the place fighting the good fight to help bring awareness to the bullying epidemic that exists in this country. And she's doing everything that she can to change that. Awesome guest. I had Jamie Masters on, who was a repeat guest from earlier in the podcast life, one of my very first interviews. And she came on, delivered amazing content about productivity and all of the stuff that she's doing with her business. And then, of course, I had Patrice Washington on, and Patrice, of course, killed it. It was an amazing episode. Really touched a lot of people. Hit home with a lot of stuff, always good information. Patrice always delivers with her episodes, and then that was it. And it stopped. And a lot of it had to do with the things that I was dealing with. And as a podcaster, as a business owner, sometimes people don't talk about the struggle that you have in business and the grind of it all and the energy that it takes to actually get out there and hustle and grind every day and every night and all night. And you just don't feel like doing anything else that requires creative energy. And so the podcast suffered. It's not the reason that the Social Strategy podcast stopped. It stopped because I just got tired of doing it. This particular show, this may be the last episode, but I do have a couple of episodes that I found that I thought were lost. So I'm probably going to publish those episodes, but I noticed the last episode that I published was actually a test episode for a class that I was teaching about podcasting. So I'll give you the quick rundown because this is not going to be a long episode, but I want to talk about the medium of podcasting really briefly and all of the things that it's done. Podcasting has enabled me to land many, many speaking gigs and get on the stage and talk about the things that are important to me. It helped me to land a book deal. It helped me connect with really large influencers. It's grown my audience. It's expanded my reach. And there are a lot of people that know who I am and what I do. And I've been able to really establish myself in the industry as an industry expert and work with a lot of wonderful people in different companies to help them deliver value in the podcasting space. I couldn't have asked for more. It was what I set out to do when I first started podcasting, and it happened. That was my intention. My intention was to get a job in podcasting and cover all ends of it, from the creation standpoint to the producing standpoint to, actually selling and creating value around podcasting and this amazing medium, because you can use it for so many things. I've worked with companies to train their sales teams, their HR teams, their training departments on how to deliver sales messages and using podcasts for sales enablement and anything and everything you can think of. And I have a few speaking gigs coming up where I'm talking about podcasting of all things and internal podcasting for corporations. And it's going to be amazing. But that's all the stuff that can happen from starting a podcast and really learning the craft. And I'm no equipment expert. I'm no audio editing wizard or expert or anything else like that. I will put that off to someone else who is much more capable than I am to do editing. Now, I do edit all my own podcasts because I actually do enjoy it. But when it comes to producing, I'm not doing that. And I do have a couple shows that are coming up that I'll be producing that I will more than likely get that to someone that I trust to produce a podcast so I can get good audio back without having to spend the time to do it, because I just don't have the time to spend on podcasting like I used to. With all that said, the space between podcasts, I am still in flux on whether or not I'm going to bring that podcast back. I sort of want to start a new podcast and leave that one where it is. There's one other interview that I have not published yet. I'm not going to mention the guest's name, because when I publish her episode, I want it to live on a podcast that's going to be around. I may actually just change the name of the Space Between podcast to something else. I hate the artwork. I do like the concept of the name, but I'm probably going to change that too. So look for a new podcast to come, but I did want to come on here, kind of give an update, because the funny thing is that I've been seeing a lot of activity on this podcast. Even though I have not published here for almost 2 years, the podcast is still getting traffic. People are still coming to the podcast. And it generally happens anytime someone searches for me or I pop up on a speaking gig, the podcast numbers will start jumping up and around. But I wanted people to know that, yes, I am still around in podcasting, even though this podcast has not been updated. Something new is coming, but I want it to be the thing that I want to do at the time. I'm not above the limited series, so I may do a limited series podcast. But that is still up for debate. So I'm not 100% sure, but I do have a few episodes that I'm probably going to publish. They'll be the lost episodes. Those may be the ones to get me to 100, because they were actually really good. But yeah, that's really it. So I'm wrapping it up. Go ahead, get out of here. No sponsors to speak of to talk about. If you do want to get into podcasting and you're curious about what tools to use and stuff to use, my current hosting is at Podbean. I also use Blueberry. Both are great companies. I actually do consulting with Blueberry, so of course I'd love for you to use those guys. But if you use Podbean, podbean.com/VR, it'll give you a 30-day free trial. I'll have the links to all of that stuff in the show notes. It's actually on the Podbean site if you go to my show page on Podbean. But I'll put all that stuff in the show notes for you to be able to click on and sign up for. And I'll also link you over to the new site, enterprisepodcaster.com. That is where all the podcast stuff is living. It's really geared towards enterprise podcasts. But at the top, there's a little bar. It's red. It'll drop down. And if you click on that, if you're a regular podcaster, you can go there and take a look at all of the resources that I have, all the stuff that I use, the reason that I switched over to Kajabi for that site. Because instead of building on WordPress, which is a great platform to build your WordPress, to build your podcast sites on, I switched to Kajabi. I needed a business site. I needed to be able to set up some courses for some clients. I needed to be able to build landing pages and do all of the stuff that I needed to do for my business. And Kajabi was a perfect platform for it at the time. It still is great. I have a couple other resources that I use for people that don't want to sink the investment into Kajabi because it's not cheap, but everything is there. I don't need lead pages. I don't need ClickFunnels. I don't need all of the other stuff. I don't need the email carriers. I can finally cancel my GetResponse account and use Kajabi's email because they just improved. They literally dropped a new improvement today. So I finally can get rid of my GetResponse email account, which I wasn't doing much with anyway. Anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here, and I will see you in the next Lost episode that I post. All right, people.
Something so small, but it's all change. And is this really where it ends? Is this really where it ends, my darling?